All right, let's jump right into it today. We're going deep on Bangladesh 2.0, and I know a lot of you out there are wondering about the U.S. and how they might be involved.
Yeah, it's a big question, especially when you're looking at it from the side of someone who supports this new Bangladesh.
Right, exactly. Like, how do you counter those arguments that are saying the U.S. had a hand in all of this? Like Jeffrey Sachs is claiming.
Definitely, Sachs makes some pretty bold statements in that piece he wrote for Common Dreams.
He does.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that the U.S. had a role in the regime change in Pakistan. And then he's trying to connect that to what happened in Bangladesh. Like there's some kind of pattern emerging.
Well, he's using this diplomatic cipher as his main piece of evidence. That secret message from Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S., the one about the meeting with Donald Liu.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That's just the
Yeah.
Secretary of State, right?
That's the one. And it really makes you think, especially when you look at what Liu supposedly said.
Yeah, like, I think if the no confidence vote against the prime minister succeeds, all will be forgiven in Washington because the Russia visit is being looked at as a decision by the prime minister. Otherwise, I think it'll be tough going ahead. I mean, it's pretty direct.
It's pretty heavy stuff. Almost sounds like a threat, right?
Yeah, for sure. So how does Sachs tie that back to Bangladesh?
Well, he's pointing out that this same guy, Liu, went to Dhaka not that long before Hasina's government collapsed. He was there talking about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy.
Right, right. The whole containing China thing.
Exactly. It's all about trying to limit China's influence. And Bangladesh is a pretty strategically important place in that whole game.
So Sachs is basically saying that the U.S. was playing chess, using Bangladesh as a pawn to try and gain some kind of advantage over China.
Seems like it. And he even brings up those reports in the Indian media where Hasina herself said that the U.S. wanted to set up military bases in Bangladesh, but she refused.
Hold on. Wouldn't that actually contradict Sachs's argument? If Hasina was pushing back against the U.S., wouldn't that mean they weren't really in control?
You're definitely onto something there. It's a good point.
And didn't we also see Bangladesh dragging its feet on those military agreements that the U.S. was pushing for?
Absolutely. And let's not forget who was pushing those agreements, Victoria Nuland, known for being pretty hawkish.
Right. So if Hasina was resisting these big U.S. players, it makes you wonder how much influence they really had. It might not be as straightforward as Sachs is making it out to be.
It's definitely something to consider. It complicates the narrative.
Okay, so we have Hasina standing up to the U.S., which is a good point for you if you're trying to argue against their involvement. What else is Sachs saying?
Well, he does admit that the U.S. has a history of getting involved in regime change, but then he kind of shifts gears and says what we really need is a UN investigation.
So he's not completely letting the U.S. off the hook.
Not at all. He wants the UN Security Council to hear from both Imran Khan and Sheik Hasina directly, wants their testimony about what went down.
Wow. But isn't the U.S. just going to veto any investigation into their actions? I mean, they have the power to do that, right?
Yeah, they probably would. Which is interesting because Sachs brings up UN Resolution ARES 76.
I don't know that one.
It basically lets the General Assembly handle things that get blocked by a Security Council veto, so every UN member gets a say.
So even if the U.S. tries to shut things down, there might be another way to bring it all out in the open.
Exactly. It shows you how seriously people are taking this issue. I mean, when someone like Jeffrey Sachs is calling for a UN investigation, you know it's a big deal.
So it sounds like Sachs is trying to make a pretty big statement with all this. Maybe he's trying to expose a pattern of U.S. intervention, even if a formal UN investigation doesn't happen.
Yeah, he's putting it out there for the whole world to see. It's like he's putting the U.S. on trial in the court of public opinion.
Okay, but let's remember you here. You're trying to build up a defense of Bangladesh 2.0 against these accusations. If people start to believe that the U.S. was behind it all, it could really hurt the new government's image, even if they weren't involved at all.
You're right, it's a tricky situation, but there are a few ways to approach it. I think the first thing is to acknowledge, the elephant in the room. Sachs is right when he says that the U.S. has a history of getting involved in regime change. You can't just ignore that.
So you're saying don't try to deny it, but instead kind of shift the focus.
Exactly. You pivot to the stuff that was happening inside Bangladesh. You emphasize how much the people wanted change, how it was a movement that came from within.
So you're saying even if there were pressures from outside, the revolution was ultimately driven by the people of Bangladesh themselves.
Exactly. You highlight the problems with Hasina's government, the economic issues, the way dissent was suppressed. Revolutions usually aren't caused by just one thing from the outside. It's more complicated than that.
Okay, so you're painting a picture of a country that was ready for change, where the people were demanding something different.
Right. And that's where you bring in Dr. Yunus. Remind people that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's someone who's dedicated his life to helping people, empowering communities. He represents the hopes of the Bangladeshi people.
So you're drawing a contrast, saying, look, this isn't some puppet government the U.S. installed. This is a government led by a respected figure who genuinely wants change.
Right. And you can actually use Sachs's own words to your advantage. Remember how he talked about Hasina refusing to let the U.S. build military bases? Well, you use that as evidence that she wasn't afraid to stand up to the U.S.
So if she was already defying them, it makes it less likely that the U.S. was behind her downfall. And if they couldn't even get Hasina to do what they wanted, it seems even less likely they could have orchestrated a whole revolution.
Yeah, it makes you question their motives and their ability to control things. It's like you're saying, if they couldn't even get their way on this one issue, how could they have been behind the entire revolution?
That's a pretty good argument. It forces people to think twice about whether the U.S. was really pulling the strings. But what about Sachs's call for a UN investigation? Wouldn't that still be a problem for Bangladesh 2.0?
It's a bit of a gamble, for sure. Any investigation could turn up something you don't want people to know. But it's also a chance to prove that you're being transparent, that you have nothing to hide.
So how do you play that?
You could say that Bangladesh 2.0 is open to a UN investigation, as long as it's fair and impartial.
That's pretty bold, but I see what you mean. It shows that you're confident and willing to work with the international community.
Yeah, and it puts pressure on the U.S. to cooperate. If they try to block the investigation, it makes them look suspicious.
Smart move. Using Sachs's own tactic against him.
But there's one thing I'm still not sure about. Sachs mentioned that Hasina had to flee to India because the military wouldn't protect her from the protesters. Doesn't that suggest that her government was losing support, even within Bangladesh? Yeah, that's something you have to address. The military's role is definitely a bit of a mystery here, but you could say that their decision not to intervene wasn't necessarily because they supported the revolution. It might have been more about internal divisions within the military itself.
Like maybe there were different factions within the military. Some that were sympathetic to the protests?
It's possible. Even if they weren't actively helping the revolution, they might have seen it as a chance to distance themselves from Hasina. Militaries have their own agendas. They're not always neutral.
Okay, so the military refusing to protect Hasina doesn't automatically mean they were pro-revolution. Maybe it was more about their own internal politics.
Exactly. And you can use that to strengthen the argument that the revolution was driven by internal factors. If the military was already divided, it suggests that Hasina was losing her grip on power, regardless of what the U.S. was doing.
So it all comes back to changing the narrative. You're shifting the focus away from the idea of the U.S. being in control and showing how the situation in Bangladesh was already complex and unstable.
You got it. And by doing that, you're not just defending Bangladesh 2.0, you're also helping people understand how revolutions really happen. It's rarely just one country manipulating another. It's usually a lot more complicated than that.
This has been really helpful. I'm feeling a lot better about how to counter these claims about U.S. involvement. But before we wrap up, I have one more question.
Yeah.
It's this idea that Sachs keeps bringing up about a pattern, like the U.S. is going around and toppling governments. It's kind of unsettling, to be honest. You think he's onto something? Like, should we be worried about that?
It's a tough one, right? Foreign policy, it's never so simple. Countries, especially powerful ones, they're always going to look out for themselves first, and they have a lot of ways to try and make things go their way.
So we shouldn't just brush off what Sachs is saying like it's some crazy conspiracy theory.
Probably not. It's always good to be skeptical, question what powerful people are doing, but we can't oversimplify things. Either blaming everything on the U.S., that's not always the whole story.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we figure this out? How do we support positive change in the world without getting played?
It all comes down to thinking critically. You have to really look at the evidence, consider different points of view, and not jump to conclusions. We also have to watch out for our own biases.
So like with Bangladesh 2.0, we need to look past all the talk about the U.S. and really try to understand why the revolution happened in the first place.
Right, you have to understand what was going on inside Bangladesh, the social and economic problems, the political climate, all the things that made this revolution possible, even without outside influence.
And we have to remember that the U.S. is just like any other country. They're going to do what they think is best for them, but that doesn't mean they're behind everything that happens in the world.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance,
Right.
Recognizing that global politics is complicated, but not falling for easy answers.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I think we've covered some complex stuff, looked at the evidence, and hopefully giving you, our listeners, some ways to think about this whole debate.
Don't forget, even if the U.S. wasn't directly involved in Bangladesh, it's worth asking what other factors might have contributed to the student-led revolution. What were those social, economic, and political conditions that made such a dramatic shift in power even possible? That's something to keep in mind as you learn more about this really interesting story.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something else that'll keep you thinking.